Good day, everybody. My name is Azim Manji, and it's my privilege and honor to welcome you to these ADB Safeguard Policy Review and Update consultations. This consultation on involuntary resettlement will occur throughout the duration of this week as a regional consultation until the 8th of December. A very warm welcome to you all from wherever you may be joining from. A few gentle reminders before we start. Firstly, please introduce yourself in the chat box by typing your name, your designation, and the organization that you represent. You may also wish to do this by typing your name, your designation, and the organization that you represent by right-clicking on your name and then renaming yourself. Please ensure your audio and video are working and you join from a quiet, distraction-free area. Please ensure that while they're working, they remain off until you're called upon to do so by the session moderator, Raisha. Please put your microphone on mute when you're not speaking, but when you are called upon to speak by Raisha, please turn on your microphone as well as your video. When making a contribution, you can also do so by typing your contribution into the chat box into one of the 3 languages that we have available for simultaneous translation today. You can virtually raise your hand on the Zoom feature to raise a point or a question. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a reaction button to the right of the globe. To make a contribution, click on the reaction button and then on the raise hand emoji. That will allow the moderator to understand that you want to make a contribution. In terms of listening to interpretations, you can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. Choose one of the 3 languages at the bottom of your screen, including English, and please remember to click on Mute Original Audio. Clicking on Mute Original Audio overrides the English speaker and goes directly to the speaker in the simultaneous translation. Today, we have simultaneous translation and interpretation available in Hindi, Urdu, and Russian. Just a reminder that you can use any of these 3 scripts, Cyrillic, Hindi script, or Urdu script, to also type your contribution in the chat box. Before we get into today's agenda, please allow me to restate the ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. This Safeguard Policy Review and Update is in Phase 2. These consultations are intended to provide opportunities for stakeholders such as yourselves to express your views and opinions on the ADB's environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner. You are encouraged to articulate your project-related inputs, concerns, and share experiences during these consultation sessions. A reminder, as you have seen on the screen, that all of these consultations will be recorded and duly documented. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to any comments and contributions made. Background materials on thematic areas have been released for reference to participants such as yourselves in preparation for these dialogues. All types of feedback are welcome and will not be used to lead to any retaliation, abuse, or any other kinds of discrimination. The written documentation from these sessions and the summary of feedback will be open for review to all participants prior to public disclosure. This ensures the comfort, safety, and accuracy, as well as transparency of the recordings. Should you have any concerns on confidentiality, risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination, please consult with the SPRU Secretariat through the email address safeguardsupdate@adb.org. That email address is flashed on your screen in the chat box now. I would now briefly like to go through today's agenda. Next on the agenda will be a welcome and an overview by the Director of the Safeguards Division, Mr. Bruce Dunn, who will provide an overview of the Safeguard Policy Statement 2009 and the update process that we are now engaged in. Session 1 will be the Safeguard Requirement 2, Involuntary Resettlement Safeguards and the Review Process by Ms. Irina Novikova, a Senior Social Development Specialist within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Following on will be the co-author of the study findings, Mr. Ralph Starkloff, an ADB consultant. Ralph will then hand over to me, who will introduce Ms. Raisha Jones, who will convene the moderated discussion, session 3A. We will then have a brief break, and I will introduce a question to be considered on the Menti app by all stakeholders prior to going to session 3B, furthering the moderated discussion, again facilitated by Ms. Raisha Jones. We will then have a brief event evaluation before proceeding to Mr. Bruce Dunn, the Director of the Safeguards Division, for his wrap-up and way forward on the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process. So with that, I would now like to introduce Mr. Bruce Dunn, Director of the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB, to offer his welcome and overview remarks. Mr. Dunn, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Azin. And good day, welcome, and thank you to all the participants joining today. It's a real pleasure to have you here for this regional consultation on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. This is a special session for civil society organisations and other non-government stakeholders, particularly for South Asia and Central and West Asia. I see that we've got, I think, more than 60 participants on the call today. We had actually 43 participants registered, that's excluding ADB participants, which were drawn from 22 countries and mostly from South Asia and Central and West Asia. The majority of those are from civil society organisations, although we do have a range of academic professionals as well as consultants and other interested parties, but quite a diversity of people on the call today. So let me thank all of you for joining, wherever you are. It's really great to have your interest and support for this session. Now, our goal, as you've heard Asim mention, is to make these consultations inclusive and meaningful for all participants. And we're really hoping that you'll be able to stay through the session and to be actively engaged in sharing your views. Now, as many of you will know, given that this is now the sixth in a series of consultations that we're running, the sixth topic, we're holding these sessions to inform the update of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS. The update was launched in August 2020, following an evaluation of the SPS by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department, the IED. The update process is expected to be implemented over a 2.5-year process, and we're targeting the approval of the new policy by March 2023. So we've got about 16 months still ahead of us in terms of the development and consultation process. Now, if you're new to these consultations and you'd like to have further information, you'll be able to find that on ADB's website. We'll be putting links into the chat box. You'll be able to find a background paper which sets out the approach for the update, as well as a stakeholder engagement plan. Plus, you'll see the consultation schedule and also the materials for the consultations. They're all available on the web. Now, for today's session, as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement, as well as issues associated with restriction of access to land. Now, this is one of the most challenging and often contentious areas with respect to development projects. And of course, anything to do with resettlement can cause major disruptions on people's lives, on their land and their livelihoods. So it's really a critical issue for us and of course for all people involved. Of course, it is also an opportunity. The application of good international standards can provide important value add and benefits for affected people. This is particularly the case when there is close consistency between our safeguards with national laws and practices, and where there is good capacity and commitment to be able to implement those on behalf of the governments or the clients that we work with. But of course, if those conditions are not present, then obviously implementation can be much more challenging and require a lot more support. Now, these issues were highlighted in the 2020 evaluation by the IED that I mentioned. And this indicated that overall, involuntary resettlement results were quite positive and satisfactory, although they pointed out that they tended to focus on compensation of affected people. But there are a wide range of issues and challenges that still need to be addressed. Now, I want to highlight a number of these just at the outset of this consultation session. And of course, we'll be coming back in some further detail to some of these during the presentations. And I'm sure many of you will have also your views on these, which we're looking forward to hear. I'll mention just 7 points very briefly. First and foremost is ensuring meaningful consultation. This is really a key issue for all projects. And we know that when we have challenging projects with respect to involuntary resettlement issues, ones, for example, with grievances or complaints that get elevated to ADB's accountability mechanism, there are often issues or perhaps gaps with the consultation process. And if this is not undertaken in an appropriate manner, not engaging with the right stakeholders or providing sufficient information and consideration of particular context under which involuntary resettlement is being undertaken, then many other issues can certainly be challenging. So getting consultation right, I think, is a key issue. Secondly is providing greater clarity on the safeguard requirements. And we have heard on this point from the Independent Evaluation Department, but we also see this ourselves in terms of being able to implement the policy, and also the types of questions that we get from our developing member countries and some of the executing agencies. So the need for being very clear in terms of what is required by the policy, due diligence, and also how this relates to other forms of land acquisition. Of course, involuntary resettlement where countries trigger eminent domain is one issue, but of course there are other forms of land acquisition such as negotiated settlements or voluntary land donations, which our existing policy doesn't provide a lot of clarity on, and we feel it's important to look at requirements in these areas as well. Third is certainly the need for improving planning for land acquisition. And of course, this needs to be based on good quality social analysis, socioeconomic studies and social impact assessment. And this, of course, needs to be linked to detailed technical designs. Fourth is strengthening livelihood and income restoration, particularly for severely affected poor and vulnerable households. And this is an area where the IED pointed out that our achievements have not been so strong, and it's an area that we also recognize. And in fact, we're doing some further studies in this area to look at how we can strengthen this area. Next, I want to mention enhancing grievance redress mechanisms. These need to be customized, particularly for the project situation and the needs and cultural context of the affected people. This is a recurring issue, and one actually that is coming up across many of the consultations that we've been doing. We've done consultations around Indigenous people safeguards, and we've heard very clearly of the need to make sure that grievance redress mechanisms are set in the appropriate cultural context. And this applies also very much in the involuntary resettlement context. Next, I'd like to mention the need for strengthening assessment processes and support for poor, vulnerable and disadvantaged individuals and groups. We need to obviously tailor the assessments and the consultation processes around people in these situations, and that includes also making sure that they are gender inclusive and gender responsive. And then lastly, of course, enhancing monitoring and oversight. This is a critical issue, particularly in challenging contexts, in high-risk project situations. We need to make sure that we've got the right level of support. And depending on the context, you need to look very carefully at independent monitoring processes and verification, as well as the processes from ADB ourselves. And then lastly, we recognise the need to look at relationships between land acquisition and involuntary resettlement with environment and other cross-cutting issues. For example, the use of natural resources or the importance of ecosystem services for affected people. These can certainly be important when we're looking at changes in land use or restrictions in land use if affected communities lose access to these services, or if you're looking at the context of resettlement sites, will they have access to these resources in the future? So this is certainly one aspect where we need to look more closely. Another is around some of the triggers for land acquisition or resettlement, which can come from other environmental media. For example, we've got experiences with projects where you may have noise impacts, and the ability or challenges in terms of maintaining noise standards could cause nuisance or impacts to affected people, which may trigger the need for either changes in project design or potentially triggering additional resettlement. So these relationships really does highlight the need for us to take a more integrated approach, an integrated assessment approach, of course, while still maintaining focus on how people would be impacted by changes in land use and access. But certainly we need to consider this relationship with environment and other issues. And of course, the context matters. So, is a project taking place in a fragile or conflict-affected situation? Are there major gaps with national and local laws and practice? Are there customary land use issues? Does the client or the executing agency have a good track record of capacity? So these types of contextual issues we find also very important, and something that we think needs to be taken into consideration much more in the screening, assessment and management processes for land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. So there's a lot of things to think about here. I've only just touched the surface, and during this consultation, I think we'll be covering a lot more details on these issues. Now, to take us into the first presentation, I'd like to, in a moment, call on my colleague, Ms. Irina Novikova. She's a senior social development specialist in the ADB, and along with other colleagues, she's leading this work on the update of the policy. She's going to be presenting to you some further details on the existing policy, and then she's going to be passing to another colleague, consultant who's supporting us, Mr. Ralph Starkloff, who'll be presenting on the background study and benchmarking work. So with that, let me again thank all of you for joining. We're looking forward to hearing your voices today, and I'll pass over to Irina for the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining in today. It's a pleasure to see you here. First, and very briefly, we would like to recap some of the fundamentals of the SPS, and particularly the Involuntary Resettlement Safeguard. We can go to the next slide, please. As Bruce already mentioned, SPS was adopted in 2009, and it became effective in March 2010. And it covers three main policy areas, or we refer commonly to them as safeguards. And involuntary resettlement is one of the three safeguards, in addition to environment and indigenous peoples. The mitigation hierarchy, which you see on the left-hand side of the slide, is the guiding principle of the SPS. So this is embedded in the policy objective, and it is replicated through all three safeguards. So it's you will find it across all safeguards. On top of this, SPS provides additional requirements for different lending modalities, and it contains a prohibited investment activities list. Next slide, please. We will not go into many details of the policy itself, because you must be already familiar with it quite in depth, but just some quick highlights we thought will be helpful. So the whole SPS, and by extension the involuntary resettlement safeguard, are applicable to all ADB financed and administered projects, and both in sovereign and non-sovereign operations. And the key components of the IR safeguard are the objective, scope, and triggers, of course, and the 12 policy principles. With the safeguards requirement number 2 being part of the policy delivery process. And the safeguard requirement number 2, of course, it's very critical, as it outlines the requirements for the borrowers and clients to meet their obligations in delivering the IR safeguard. Next slide, please. Here you see the key requirements listed for involuntary resettlement. I will not go through all of them, through all the details on this slide, but we included it just for reference in case it will be helpful for the discussion. So you can see on the left-hand side how the mitigation hierarchy fits into the IR principles and IR requirements. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the key requirements, such as screening, categorization, preparation of a mitigation plan, restoration of livelihood and restoration of assets lost, monitoring provisions, and various protections for different categories of people. Next slide, please. As Bruce mentioned, Independent Evaluation Department came out with quite a few recommendations for improving the implementation of policy provisions for involuntary resettlement, and also thinking about additional provisions that will help strengthen how resettlement and land acquisition is done in ADB projects. I will not repeat many of the points, but I just wanted to highlight a few which are quite critical, and you would see them, you will be able to trace them in our key themes discussion that will follow. So one of the key issues that we would like to focus on is the livelihood restoration and improvements. And in particular, the recommendation comes for restoration of incomes and livelihoods for severely affected, poor, and vulnerable households. Another recommendation also sets out some requirements or some rules for improved consultations, in particular, particularly in sovereign operations. There are two questions that would require renewed or updated policy provisions. And the first one is a new integrated approach to risk assessment and categorization. It is stated that the use of the numerical threshold, which ADB applies, and it is 200 severely affected persons, to designate a project as category A, that this approach is not adequate to fully capture the risks in projects related to land acquisition. And it just doesn't capture all various other contextual risks or direct risks related to livelihood losses or institutional capacity or country contexts. So the recommendation is to reassess the risk approach and categorization approach. Then another critical recommendation is to provide an enhanced mechanism to assess social risks. And that's something that was already mentioned by Bruce. In particular, this relates to the preparation or to the requirements for integrated environmental and social impact assessment. And this assessment can be an umbrella tool or umbrella mechanism that will organize all project-related impact assessments and mitigation plans. And this is something that already exists in the requirements of other MFIs. Now let me turn to the IR update process. Next slide, please. This year, ADB has conducted a comparative study, or we refer to it as a benchmarking study, of land acquisition requirements across key MFIs. But I wanted to mention that this particular study, it comes on the heels of many other internal deliberations, discussions, and workshops held internally in ADB to examine implementation issues related to land acquisition. In addition, ADB launched a couple of complementary studies last year, and one of them is on asset valuation, how we do valuations and what the constraints are, and another study is on livelihood restoration. And both of these studies will inform the development of guidance materials related to land acquisition. Now, ADB is conducting series of thematic consultations, and as this consultation today, and these thematic consultations will allow us to collect external inputs. So this time around, we would like to present the initial findings of the background research that we have been doing so far, as well as some of the discussions that we had. And for that, I would like actually to pass over now to my colleague, Ralph Stavkov. And Ralph is a senior development consultant, social development consultant, and he is a former ADB staff. So over to you, Ralph. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone, wherever you are. Can we have the next slide, please? All right, I'll be looking, first of all, into some of the findings of the benchmarking study, highlighting some key issues here. But there's much more to be discussed and to be looked at if you review our summary of the benchmarking study and eventually our full report on the benchmarking study. So this serves as just a start. All of the MFIs, including ADB, share among their objectives the need to avoid and minimize adverse involuntary resettlement impacts, and of course to mitigate whatever unavoidable remaining impacts are occurring. Within the objectives, some of our comparators have included the avoidance of forced evictions, compensation at replacement cost, and stakeholder engagement to explicitly highlight their importance. ADB, of course, discusses replacement cost and stakeholder engagement as two key requirements throughout, but they are not entailed in the objectives of the policy and SR2. Some MFIs include requirements for voluntary land transactions, such as voluntary land donations, among them EBRD and the World Bank. which we have at this point not in our policy. Some MFIs allow also the application of the involuntary resettlement standard to livelihood impacts which are not caused directly by land acquisition. Again, something that ADB addresses in the context of the environmental assessment, but there are no explicit provisions for social impact assessment and mitigation of such non-land acquisition social impacts. In terms of risk classification and categorization, all MFIs have adopted a risk-based integrated environmental and social assessment and an integrated categorization with some variations. ADB has kept categorization and impact assessment clearly separated between the 3 safeguards requirements. And except for ADB, none of our comparators are using the 200 plus significantly affected persons as a threshold for identifying category A significant impact projects. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of preparation of resettlement planning documents, obviously all MFIs require some type of resettlement planning document. They vary in nomenclature, but in essence, they are more or less identical in type. Some of the comparators are using the means of a resettlement framework for projects without impact assessments prepared before project approval to get projects started. ADB has a provision for this, but is limiting that to for financing modalities such as multi-tranche financing, investments, emergency or sector projects, programs, or some standalone projects which have sub-projects that cannot yet be prepared, but these are restricted to category B projects. Stakeholder engagement is, of course, for everybody an important element in safeguards management. All MFIs do require the disclosure of relevant information about displacement impacts and mitigation measures in local languages and an accessible, culturally appropriate manner. Some MFIs are detailing the type of information and who ought to be consulted in what manner, such as EBRD, the World Bank, and IDB. This may include the consideration of alternative designs, options for involuntary resettlement and livelihood restoration and improvement. It should be covered during planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of projects and of the resettlement management. Gender and vulnerability issues and how to ensure that men, women, and vulnerable people are considered in the stakeholder engagement process, and of course, a requirement for documentation. Except for ADB, none of the MFIs explicitly require the full disclosure of resettlement documents on their website. ADB is very particular about that. Next slide, please. This includes also monitoring reports. The public disclosure of monitoring reports is an explicit mandate that ADB makes. To ensure verification of the completion of resettlement plan implementation, especially for category A projects, other MFIs may require land acquisition and involuntary resettlement completion reports or external compliance reviews. Again, the names of the reports may differ, but there are land acquisition and involuntary resettlement focused reports by which compliance has to be verified and certified. ADB does not require standalone IR completion audits and reports, but it mandates, of course, ongoing monitoring and evaluation throughout the project cycle, and it discloses the completion of implementation in project completion reports, including about land acquisition and resettlement. Now, in terms of the roles and responsibilities of borrower, client, and ADB, the division of responsibility is quite comparable across all MFIs. The MFIs usually undertake screening, due diligence, supervision, support, and capacity building, while the borrower implements all the requirements for safeguards management of the standards. Now, next slide, please. Thank you. I will now move on to some key issues for further consideration. These are highlighting some of what internal ADB consultations among safeguard colleagues have yielded, and about which we would like to get your feedback, among other issues. So let me quickly go through these. The adoption of a performance standard approach with binding requirements for borrowers and ADB, including their staff, and clarification of the differential roles and responsibility for the management of land acquisition and land use restrictions is a strongly considered proposal within ADB, and we would like to get feedback from our stakeholders on whether SPS should be changing towards a performance standard. The adoption of a risk-based approach to screening, scoping, and categorization of land acquisition and land use restriction without a numerical threshold for impact significance, the 200+ threshold, we would like to get rid of. Adoption of an integrated environmental and social impact assessment as an overarching assessment tool to cover all anticipated social risks and impacts of a project with specific requirements for land acquisition and land use restriction. Integration, as Bruce Dunn has already pointed out, would allow us to look at the interface between environmental and social issues, which also very much are critical in the management of land acquisition related impacts, but also other social impacts. Next, please. In terms of the scope of application, we would, or we are considering at this point, a number of changes or additions. We would like to cover both involuntary and voluntary forms of land acquisition, land use restriction, improve implementation practices, and provide clearer guidance for both. Voluntary land acquisition includes the sales of land, lease of land, donations, land pooling, land swapping, and consensual land use restrictions for example, environmental protection purposes. We want to see that it's documented as being truly voluntary. We would like to see the replacement principle to be considered, and therefore we are proposing that voluntary forms of land use restriction and land acquisition should be covered by the policy. We furthermore would like to clarify provisions related to land use restriction and restriction on access regarding both infrastructure and natural resource management related impacts. We see, especially under infrastructure projects, often temporary and at times permanent restrictions of access, which require better clarification in our policy. To clarify provisions for social impacts of associated facilities, existing facilities, legacy issues, and cumulative impacts, and their mitigation as well requires better clarification in the opinion of ADB safeguard specialists. To clarify provisions for mitigation of livelihood impacts and asset losses not caused by land acquisition, we discussed that topic. We would like to follow our comparator MFIs in that to be more explicit. At least some of our comparators are very clear on that. Next, please. There are a number of other provisions we would like to see strengthened. First of all, the linking of project readiness with the planning instruments that we require. We consider that implementation ready land acquisition plans can go straight into implementation, while a framework approach may have to be used to get a project started, but then we need strong provisions for scoping to ensure that there is sufficient capacity to handle projects that are approved only with a resettlement framework approach, and provisions that project implementation has to be initiated through the initial planning process of land acquisition and land use restrictions. Further clarifications we would also like to provide for valuation of lost assets, livelihood restoration need to be strengthened, relocation of non-titled displaced persons, vulnerability and gender, mitigation measures for host communities, strengthening of capacity of the borrowers, and external and third-party monitoring and verification. Okay, I'll keep it at that. We can further discuss issues of interest to you later. I will now hand over to Azim to continue the consultation process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph. And thank you, Irina and Bruce as well, for your contributions and overview. Just a reminder of Ralph's last 3 slides, which provide us some insight and some further issues for discussion. And before I turn over to Raisha Jones, who will moderate the discussion on this and other issues, may I please just take a few minutes to remind you that you are free to provide your contributions, your questions, as well as share your experiences both live on the video and on voice. When Raisha asks you or requests you to make your contribution and ask your question, please turn on your mic, turn on your video if you prefer, introduce yourself, tell us who you are and which organization you represent, and then share your experience or raise your question. A further reminder that you should also feel free to do this on the chat box in any of the languages we have available through the simultaneous interpretation service, and that is English, Russian, Hindi, or Urdu, and the simultaneous interpreters will relay that question back so that we can all understand it. One final reminder before we get to the facilitated discussion is that on the chat box now, you will see a question that we will come back to later in the session, and we will ask you, how can the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process better respond to your needs, better improve the effectiveness of these consultations, and take your considerations and viewpoints on board? Are there specific ideas that you have or opportunities that we might have missed in terms of engaging you as stakeholders that we can learn from and better improve these consultations? So if you have an idea of that, just click on the Menti app anytime between now and an hour after this session ends, and let the ADB Safeguard Policy Review and Update team know how specifically they can improve these consultations. With that in mind, may I please ask Ms. Raisha Jones to take on the role of facilitating the moderated discussion through some of the guide questions that you see up on screen. And Ms. Jones will guide you through how the questions will be taken so that we all have an understanding of the openness and transparency of the contributions that you can make to these consultations. So Raisha Jones, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Azim, and welcome everyone today to our moderated session. So I hope you've all had your coffee wherever you might be and are ready to join us in some lively discussion. So let's kick off. I'm first going to take a little reminder then again. First going to take some raised hands. We're going to look at the pre-questions and then in the chat box. That's the sequence. Can I just go back one slide to the folks organising? We're back to our questions there. Okay, so today we're talking about involuntary resettlement, involuntary land acquisition and resettlement. So we really want to focus the discussion on this topic today. We really want to hear what you have liked about the policy, what you haven't. I know that there will be a lot of people on today's call who've had a lot of project-specific challenges. So if you have had project challenges, I really want you to think about what would you like to see changed in the policy? What would really help you on your project in the future if the policy was different? All right, so without further ado, I'm going to open this up for questions. I can see raised hands already, so let's start raising our hands, everyone, and we're going to go one by one in a time-based order. So I can see already we've got Mr. Voseking. I spelt that right. Knut Voseking.
Okay, that's me. Knut working with Urgewald in Germany. Yeah, well, Bruce and team, I think what you have presented now is the step in the right direction. You know that that Urgewald did a survey on the recent development projects and programs of the ADB from 2015 to end of 2020, and we came up with some troubling things that seem to be at least becoming addressed in the new shape of the SPS. One thing that is troubling is that round about 46% of all project-related programs and operations of the ADB have been related to one or the other kind of resettlement impact. So let's say from small land acquisition to a big resettlement, from economic impacts that just impact a few people up to really huge impacts. And so over those 4.5 years, 1 million people have been impacted. And what we have seen is that the documentation of this is really insufficient. We found contradictory reports, numbering of people diverging from households to people, so that you can't even follow who is actually impacted. And so there has to be an improvement. And I can upload our presentation slides here, if you like, for everyone to look at. And we think that we see a problem in the whole structure of this whole SPS architecture. If you really want to go to the performance standard thing, then you have to make clear that all these things that you outlined over the last minutes are in the realm of the ADB and are not diverted to the client, because what we have seen and what, for example, also the internal evaluation of the World Bank has stated when they reviewed the World Bank safeguard system, is that there was an over-reliance on reporting by the client. And so I think this has to be in your hand, has to remain in your hand. And then I think if you go this path that you're outlining, there might be some improvement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Versaking. So I can see your particular topic, well, you covered quite a few things there, but certainly an over-reliance on the reporting of the client and more things you think should be placed on ADB. Now, that's kind of a bigger policy question. So I might put that over to Bruce. Bruce, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, happy to tackle that, and then perhaps my colleagues might come on some additional points. So yeah, firstly, thank you very much to Ugwald and to you. You've been joining a number of our consultations and sharing views, which is extremely helpful. This is an area where I have to assure we want to get right and strengthen, and of course ensure that our clients or the developing member countries that we work with also have clarity in terms of what is required, and that we also provide the right level of capacity support as well as oversight. I think one of the issues that you point to there is in relation to how do we structure the new policy in relation to ADB's responsibilities versus the responsibilities of the client. And that's something that we recognise and know that we need to get right. Firstly, I think it has to be clear that we do provide financing often as a suite of financiers, including governments or private sector clients, to support projects. And that we're not the project proponents ourselves or the project owners. So clearly the responsibilities for meeting the safeguards, we need to be very clear in terms of what the obligations are for those clients and borrowers. And I think that's something we'd like to strengthen with the existing policy. The current safeguard policy is fairly high level, I have to say, in terms of the policy principles and then the supporting requirements. And it was certainly an issue that the Independent Evaluation Department pointed to, and I think we see ourselves that the level of detail there in terms of what is required and by who needs to be strengthened. So I think we would like to come with greater clarity and further definition in a lot of this within the policy, but of course also in further details within guidance documents that would support policy implementation. But first and foremost, the policy itself needs to be very clear. So that's a key thing for us to work on, is making sure that clarity is there in the policy. Secondly, I think you point to, quite rightly, ADB's role. Now, ADB's role is not to implement the safeguards. That's one thing to be clear, but we do have a role in terms of, firstly, the due diligence work before we make decisions. So, reviewing what work has been done, giving directions to the clients. But then once we've taken a decision to support a project and it's under implementation, then clearly our responsibilities there in terms of support to the client, but then monitoring and supervision. And those aspects around monitoring and supervision, we take seriously and would like to strengthen. So that's something we also need to be very clear in ADB's own staff instructions, how we undertake that work. it can't just be monitoring reports from the clients themselves. We know that's to your point in reference to the World Bank. And particularly in higher risk situations, you've got a lot of people affected, or where your context for involuntary resettlement is challenging. You certainly need to be engaging, I would say, more effectively or more frequently also third-party monitors or independent monitoring and verification processes for the involuntary resettlement, in addition to what we do ourselves. So I think that's another aspect to look at. And then lastly, you pointed to, and of course we're very happy to look at the studies that you've undertaken. It's great if you can put things also into the chat so others can see transparently. But you talk about data, and I think data is another area, involuntary resettlement, but also across the safeguards, where we recognize we need to strengthen, terminology and definitions, data requirements. I think sometimes in our documentation, you would see things like affected households. Maybe in other documents, you might see affected individuals. And I can see how that could be challenging in terms of the terminology. So we do need greater consistency in that. I can also just share with you briefly something that we're starting to implement now inside ADB is what we're calling an integrated safeguard monitoring system, or ISMS. We're using now information technology tools that we've not had available in a sophisticated level to develop a system where we can capture and more transparently report on data across our portfolio, which also would give us an ability to manage issues more effectively. So that's another aspect that we are looking at in terms of having stronger systems across the portfolio. So I'll stop there. Some of my colleagues may have some more technical comments to come to perhaps, but thank you.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Okay, we're actually going to move on. We've got some more questions that we need to run through, give everyone a chance to have their questions answered here today. So I'm going to call on Mahindu. Mahindu had submitted a question previously. Mahindu, are you there? Please turn your camera on if you're like, or your voice. You had a question around the use of escrow funds. And so Mahindu, hopefully you're here and can ask your question today. I'm not hearing them. All right, we might come back. Hopefully, maybe they're having some technical issues and can ask their question a bit later. Okay, so we're going to move on then. So we've got Murat. They've put a question in the box. Murat, would you like to ask your question about the situation in Uzbekistan in connection with land acquisition and resettlement? Murat? We can't hear you. Hopefully, maybe the translation's coming through. We might just give them a little bit of time. And I guess I would remind everyone again, please, if you've got project situations, to tell us what you think we can improve on in the policy based on your situation. Okay, nothing from Murat then? Okay, all right, then let's move on. Maybe we can come back to them a bit later. Ray, so we're going to move on then. Ryan Hassan from the NGO Forum. Ryan, would you like to put on your microphone and tell us your question today?
Sure. Thanks, Risha. So my question is basically pretty simple. If you look at the original 2009 ADB SPS, there is a provision there that you have to probably craft or produce multiple resettlement plans for the affected communities and then see where they're going to be resettled. And we've seen through project experiences that it is not the best resettlement plan which often gets selected down the pipeline. So I remember in the Cambodia Railway Rehabilitation Project that the resettlement site which was finally chosen was the one which was the farthest away from where the communities were originally displaced. And that vast distance led to a lot of the local communities ending up taking monetary loans, children actually being uprooted from going to school. And then there was an incident, there was a car crash, and one of the kids died on the way to school. So it's always not the best option which gets selected, and it's often the cost-effective option which gets selected. And that's where I guess the entire principle of the safeguards fails. So my question is, how will the new ADB SPS ensure that the resettlement plan which will finally be selected upholds the prioritization that they're going to be, the risk is going to be minimized or their lives are going to be made better? So that's my question.
Ryan, such a good question, and it's a topic we've really already been looking at in a lot of depth. So I'm going to hand that one over to Ralph to talk about the resettlement sites in the new draft resettlement standards. So Ralph, that one's over to you.
Yeah, I think this is a very good proposal to strengthen provisions for comparison of resettlement sites and the process involved in getting there. You said lots of people had to take out loans to actually handle a remote location. And I would agree that this is not a desirable approach. I think we want to, or we are considering, first of all, a improvement of the provisions for alternative project design, so that we can first of all avoid necessary resettlement, or we seek to minimize the resettlement. And then we will definitely note your proposal that we should possibly compare alternative resettlement sites in case there are physical relocation of people necessary. The way you stated it, that we have to actually compare multiple, or prepare and compare multiple resettlement plans, that is actually not a provision in the SPS as it was formulated. But I think it would be very useful, and I have taken a note of it, to also compare alternatives for possible resettlement sites and strengthen our mandate for due diligence in looking at the pros and cons for alternative sites. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ralph. And Ryan, such a great question. So next we're going to be hearing from Toshiyuki Doi, who wants to ask about the mitigation hierarchy. Over to you. Please unmute yourself. Toshiyuki.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Hello?
Yes, we can definitely hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. My name is Toshi. I'm a senior advisor with Mekong Watch, and I usually work in Southeast Asia, but I hope it's okay for me to speak up here because my question is a very general question, which has to do with the so-called mitigation hierarchy that gets mentioned in the analytic study and also at the previous presentations several times. The mitigation hierarchy has to do with avoiding, minimizing, and also mitigating involuntary resettlement impacts wherever applicable. My question has to do with, in particular, the first two principles of avoiding and mitigating involuntary resettlement impacts. Of course, where I'm coming from is these two principles are extremely important, particularly to poor and vulnerable local communities, and based on my experiences on the ground as well. So I would definitely like the ADB to retain or even strengthen these two principles. But for that, I would like to know how ADB has actually been implementing these principles or supervising its implementation by ADB's clients and borrowers. So I went back to the 2020 IED study, for example, which does provide some narratives over a few cases in countries like Uzbekistan and PNG, but also says that desk review they conducted provided limited insights regarding this issue because the available information was limited. So my question is, where can I find more information and data to know how ADB has actually implemented these principles of avoidance and mitigation of IR, particularly vis-a-vis other MFIs? And if no or little data is available on this issue, will ADB provide us with such data at later stages of the of this review exercise? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toshiyuki. So I think this might be a combination of Ralph and Irina. So Ralph, maybe you can speak to the first piece around retaining or strengthening the mitigation hierarchy for avoiding first and then mitigating second. And then Irina, maybe you can speak to the piece around the data and accessing the data. So Ralph, I'm going to hand over to you first.
Right, thank you. Yeah, Toshi, appreciate your question. It's a really important one, and lots of us at ADB Safeguards, among ADB Safeguards colleagues, would like to see strengthening of the provisions, and we are working on the consideration of more clear provisions for clarifying in each resettlement plan what design, project design, technical design alternatives have been considered, and what is their comparative impact in terms of land acquisition and resettlement, and to clearly demonstrate in each resettlement plan and then justify which option was chosen, and to show why those impacts that cannot be avoided must be accepted, of course, with adequate compensation at replacement cost. But yeah, a clear documentation and justification of the final design choice, and showing how all efforts were made to avoid and minimize. I think that will be helpful also to document in the future very clearly how ADB has implemented this mandate. Irina, please add something. And I also see Bruce is ready to say something here.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Ralph, and thanks for a very good question. I just wanted to mention on the data issue. So there are a few sources where this the development of this mitigation hierarchy application can be tracked. So ADB has a requirement to prepare resettlement for the borrower to prepare the resettlement plans, as Ralph mentioned. So they can be first draft resettlement plans prepared based on feasibility studies and sort of preliminary designs, technical designs, and some initial screening and discussion of options should definitely be presented in those draft plans. But then there is also a requirement to update those plans in line with technical designs. So when final implementation-ready resettlement plans are prepared and disclosed, this additional information on the changes and differences between the initial and final design should be captured. And then that has a direct implication for resettlement impacts and other social impacts. And there is another source of information that's also accessible, and these are monitoring reports. And this can be just routine monitoring reports or compliance or completion reports, which reflect how resettlement plans were implemented. And in those reports, you would also be able to track if there are differences between the final plans and any design changes that happened during implementation. And it's very frequent that projects actually do introduce changes in the designs, in the final designs, and frequently these changes are in fact related with the desire to minimize resettlement impacts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina. Okay, we're going to move on now. So Vijay Dinka from India, from Growth Watch. I see you've got a question on how to incorporate the World Bank policy. So please go and turn off your microphone. Vijay, have we got you there? Feel free, unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly. Okay, well, we can try and come back to them if we've got time. I'm going to keep going then to Norjay Jaruta from Resettlement Action, who's a Resettlement Action Plan Specialist, and looking forward to the differences between ADB project RAP preparation. So please, please go ahead, Norjay.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, so my question is, since we handled projects here in the Philippines, we handled projects from ADB, from JICA and World Bank as a funding agency in implementing and preparation of resettlement action plan. And here in the Philippines, we have ADB and JICA joint funded project, a North-South commuter railway project. So we have this preparation of RAP, a joint JICA social safeguard policy and ADB social safeguard policy. So we incorporate those two policy to come up with a one entitlements and compensation for the preparation of the resettlement action plan. So we're talking about incorporation of World Bank policy here in ADB social safeguard policy. And one of the when I joined, I heard of the ADB considering the donations on land acquisition on that matter. As we already have identified those gaps between those different funding agencies. And my question is, we are now on the preparation of the resettlement action plan on this project. And if this policy will be implemented, does it affect or does it considered to be included in our RAP preparation updating?
Those are excellent, excellent questions, Norjay. So I think maybe because this is a wider policy issue, we might ask Bruce or Madhu if they would like to jump in. All right, Bruce, there you go.
I think Madhu would be best placed on this one, which is coming.
Okay, Nurja, as you mentioned, your project is already approved and it's under implementation. So there is a project agreement between ADB and the client, and that refers to your 2009 SPS. So whatever is being implemented will be as per that loan agreement. For our policy to take a while, we just started the stakeholder consultation process. We have identified some gaps in our policies. Then we'll go through a series of consultation to basically understand what provisions will go into our IR safeguard standard. And then we will also share the draft policy provisions as well as the final policy. So it's a long process. Based on the current timeline, as Bruce has already mentioned, we plan to take the revised policy to our board by March 2023. And we will need another year, 6 months to a year, but a year, basically for the policy to be effective. So obviously all clients and projects, when we process those loans, will be notified that which policy will apply. But for your case, which is Malal, for the project that is already ongoing between the co-financing between ADB and JICA, the project you mentioned in the Philippines will follow the SPS 2009. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thanks, Risha.
Great, thank you so much, Madhu. So I can see, I think there's been a lot in the chat, a lot of discussion about the categorization and the use for Category A projects of the 200 threshold. So I think one of the first people to ask about this was from Uzbekistan, Mamanbek Raymov. If you're there, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question about categorization. Mamanbek?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Hello. Yes, thank you. I have one question concerning to the categorization form in case of resettlement. Okay, in SPSS says that 200 EP physically displaced or lost than more than 10% of productive asset. Yeah, but how about affected households who has partial residential impact, but they have some land, existing land. After the project, they can live there. They can rebuild the land in that place. But in case, this question is in case of linear projects. Yeah. In this case, should we consider these affected households also in a group of 200 EP or not? Thank you in advance for the answer.
Thank you so much. So, I think this particular issue with categorization has come up a lot in the discussions about the revision to the SPS. So I think we're going to go to Irina and then maybe Ralph for this.
Thank you, Risha. Thanks a lot, Mamanbek. That's a very good question. I think we will not be able to talk about the project specifics. So we will be very happy to get back to you if there is a specific concern about a particular project. Overall, I wanted to confirm, though, from the policy perspective, when we are taking into account during due diligence the number of affected persons, we should cover both partial and full impacts. And it is without the mitigation strategy yet. So what you are talking about in terms of resettling on the remaining plot, that relates to the mitigation measure. But we are counting the impacts first. And that already is in the policy. So to sum it up, full and partial, temporary and permanent impacts are counted to identify the full range and the full scope of impacts in the project. Thank you.
Thanks, Irina. And perhaps, Ralph, you might want to speak to a little bit about what we're looking at in terms of future changes to the policy on that categorization process and where we're at with that.
Yes. We want to get away from a numerical threshold because we feel that it does not reflect the true significance of impacts in quite a few cases. there may be more than 200 households displaced, but we are working in a country with a very strong safeguards-oriented land acquisition law, or we're working with a development partner with implementation experience and a reliable track record, in which case the impact may not be so significant. If we are in a linear project where a few people will lose agricultural land, but we can rely on that it will be replaced or livelihood measures will be provided, which will be able to replace what is lost. On the other hand, there may be just 50 households, but they will all get inundated by a reservoir. And according to the 200 persons, 50 persons affected, I should say, sorry. These people would not be in a category A project, but inundation and heavy relocation is certainly a significant impact. So we want to move towards a assessment which looks at the context, the type of impact which occurs, rather than counting, just counting numbers. We will always obviously consider numbers, but they will not be the only criterion. So we are moving more towards what our partners are doing, looking at an integrated risk assessment and impact assessment. And so this question may then have to be answered by looking at the specific situation within your project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ralph. Okay, I'm just going to go back to some of those people who may have dropped off the call earlier. So Mahindu, if you're on the call now, please turn off your mic, turn you off mute, and ask your question if you're there. Mahindu? Mahindu had a question about the use of escrow funds in the future. No. Okay. All right. What about Murat? Are you back online now? And if you are, would you like to ask your question? Murat, please go ahead if you're on the call, if you've come back through. Okay. What about Vijay Dinka? If you're there. If any of you are here, okay. Okay, it looks like they've dropped off the call. Okay, so next we have, let me see, we have Zulfia, also from Uzbekistan. Zulfia, if you would like to ask your question. I think also asking about categorization. Sophia, I think you're trying to ask your question.
Слышно, дорогие участники конференции? Я бы хотела бы задать то, что вот участник Римов Маманбек задал. Вот, я бы хотела бы узнать, на основании чего нашему проекту был присужден не категория С, а категория А. Вот, наш проект является в Узбекистане, в Средней Азии, по электрификации железнодорожной линии Бухара-Мыскент-Ургенч. Вот, был подготовлен ряд отчетов, ЛАРП-1, ЛАРП-2, и вот просто затрагиваемые домохозяйства были меньше, чем попадают под категорию А. Спасибо.
It sounds like a very project-specific question. Irina, would you like to jump in on that one? And after this question, we're going to go to a break.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much, Zulfia, for your question. I think I agree with Risha. It's a project-specific issue. We would like to get in touch with you to provide any additional clarifications, if that's okay, because there can be some specific context that relates to that project, if you don't mind. So we will be happy to clarify and address it offline. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come for our second round of Q&A after that. So we'll see you in 5 minutes' time. All right, I think we're starting the timer. Okay, welcome back everyone. So we're now moving into the second round of our moderated discussion here today. Thank you all for your wonderful participation in our first round. So as you can see on the slide, we've got some questions. We've got some questions up already, so you can have a look at these. And if you have really strong opinions, we'd love to hear from you. So I'm going to run through them really briefly. The first piece is around the use of a new standard, and whether it should cover both voluntary and involuntary land acquisition. So voluntary might be a farmer who decides to donate 5% of their land towards a new road, versus involuntary, which might be the use of eminent domain. And should they both be covered in a new standard? We've talked a lot about categorization and the use of a more risk-based assessment of categorization, but please, if you've got really more strong opinions about those, we'd like to hear them. Matching planning requirements with the readiness of the technical design. So this is often an implementation challenge when we're preparing a project, is that the project design isn't ready for which you need in order to make the resettlement plan, and how would it be better to match those the timelines up there in the policy. Addressing impacts on livelihoods not caused by land acquisition. So this could be anything from more broader social impacts to those where the acquisition of land indirectly causes loss of livelihoods. Also, monitoring compliance with the requirements for the mitigation of land acquisition. So monitoring compliance. So, all right, so please raise your hand and I'll go through sort of in a first come, first served basis if you have particular thoughts on these issues. Please raise your hand or type in the chat box. If you'd rather type in the chat box, that's totally okay as well. Oh, yes. Knud, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, it's me again. I just wanted to talk to points 1 and 3 mainly. First, I think the voluntary land acquisition issue is something where we really have to have a very good due diligence whether voluntary really means voluntary. Especially, you know, there are cases where at least some colleagues told us that when the land acquisition was handed on from the project implementer to an external agency, that then, yeah, there were cases where people were compelled with threats of violence to hand over. Also, if you have let's say not so democratic countries where there's no rule of law, then also if a local party official comes to your place and tells you, please donate voluntarily or otherwise, ... those are voluntary donations which probably are not voluntary. So the due diligence should cover at least a longer time period to the past to really check whether there hasn't been a clearance of land that is not obvious. So and it should be a time period where these kinds of bad actions can't be hidden. And also to point 3, I think that we really are facing problems when when the project design is deliberated already with the board or so, and there's no real clear land acquisition planning going on, or resettlement planning going on, because then it's more like a carte blanche from the board, and they may face a lot of problems afterwards. So I think, especially when it comes to resettling people to these kinds of grave impacts on livelihoods, things have to be done before, and it has to be a full picture of the planning and of the project design before it goes anywhere near decision. Thanks.
Hannah, thank you so much. Okay, so, you know, I think you've really hit on some of the key issues with using voluntary measures, threats of violence and coercion. So I'm going to hand over to Ralph then for a bit of a response on what we're thinking for the future.
Yes, all right. Thank you, Knud. Very important contributions. The sentiment within the community of ADB safeguard specialists is that voluntary donations must be shown to be truly voluntary. And we need to prevent the kind of situation that you have described in your contribution. I appreciate that you point out that we need to look at the time period. And again, as I said before, the context in which, the political context in which these kind of resettlement decisions and land acquisition decisions are made, so that we get a better sense of whether people are manipulated or coerced, or whether they are truly willing to donate or willing to sell. It is a tricky matter. It takes good due diligence. We agree. That's why we want to bring voluntary land acquisition within the purview of the policy. Your other question is a tricky one. We do understand we don't want a carte blanche, but please consider the following problem. A lot of resources are spent during the project planning phase to prepare so-called draft resettlement plans, because a final design is often not yet available. There will be changes as the project is being developed. We end up having to do yet another social impact assessment once eventually the final design is available, and then the borrowers have often insufficient resources to do a thorough social impact assessment. So we are wondering whether a solution is possible where we say, okay, if the design is ready, if the resources are there to do final implementation ready resettlement plans, yes, we'll approve the project on that basis. But if that is not the case, we do some thorough due diligence and scoping together, ADB together with the borrower, and decide on a resettlement framework where we outline scope, likely scope of resettlement impacts, and where we decide on the principles and procedures for undertaking resettlement planning and for mitigating the impacts and for monitoring the implementation of the plans. But we do that only once the design is available, because at the moment, the situation is often not very reliable with resettlement planning. And we want to prevent that later on, when it really counts, resources are not available. So there should be a stronger focus on connecting a final design with implementation-ready resettlement plans. Now, this is a matter that we should go on debating further, and we certainly will, but this is what is on our mind when we think about this kind of issue.
Thank you so much, Ralph. All right, is there anyone else who would like to raise their hand if they have a strong opinion on any of these particular topics? I can't see any raised hands here. So what I might do in the meantime, I might ask Irina to answer one of the earlier questions Mahindu had asked around the use of escrow accounts and what that might look like in future policy and what the discussion is that we're having around it now. Irina?
Yes, thanks a lot, Risha. I will be very quick. So there is no direct stipulation in the SPS about escrow accounts, but we appreciate that this practice exists in ADB projects, and specifically in cases where there are legal and administrative impediments to paying of compensation. And these impediments may relate to multiple claims existing on the same land issue, inheritance issues, absenteeism. So when the project cannot locate people, the owners of the land, in this exceptional cases, there is sort of the mechanism to deal with them is through escrow accounts. Given that there is no specific guidance on the use of escrow accounts, we would actually like to reflect that in the policy and add the provision that clarifies the cases when escrow account can be used, under what circumstances, what kind of due diligence is required if escrow accounts are to be used, and limiting it to only exceptional cases, which we would outline. Thank you. Thanks, Vish.
Thanks so much, Irina. Now I can see Yelena's typed a question into the chat. It's about the categorization and that threshold of the 200 people. So Yelena, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly? Yelena? We can't yet hear you. Hopefully you're there and can unmute yourself. In the meantime, I can read out a little bit about your question. So you're asking about providing more details on the removal of that 200 affected person threshold. Is it removal or is it substitution with some other type of threshold? A complete removal of any risk, a complete removal of any type of threshold may lead to a risk of miscategorization or undercategorization. And Category A projects require external monitoring, while Category B involve external monitoring as optional. So this is quite long, but I think I might hand over to Ralph. I think he can probably touch on those. I think there's about 3 important issues in Yelena's question there. Ralph, would you like to take this one? This might be one of our last questions for today.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. The concern about underreporting and favoring Category B projects over Category A projects is something that we are also looking at. But with regard to the external monitoring, there is a strong consideration and in the discussion among colleagues to make external monitoring mandatory for both Category A and B projects. We feel that that would be a more reliable arrangement and also an incentive to be completely transparent about the actual impacts and their severity. The problem with the 200 plus I already addressed is that the numbers don't necessarily correspond to the actual severity of impact. In an environment where there is good capacity and reliability, maybe larger numbers can not be a significant impact, while small numbers in a difficult environment may actually be a significant impact. So this is again what's on our mind with regard to this problem. But underreporting has to be always countered by good due diligence, and we are seeking strengthening of due diligence requirements from the planning into the implementation phase. Thank you.
All right, we've got about 2 more minutes. We've got about 2 more minutes left for questions. I can see Yelena said thank you. If there's anyone else, we've got just a couple more minutes. Please feel free to type your last question in the box or raise your hand. It's been such a lively discussion today. We really appreciate the feedback as we move through this process of consultation on the policy and what it might look like in the future. All right, so I'm going to ask Azim to take over now to help us close out our session for today. Azim, over to you.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of those who responded, to Irina, to yourself, Reisha, to Ralph, to Bruce, and a particular thanks to all of those who actually asked the questions either on chat or live streamed it in the discussion here. That's what this session is all about. We hope to have many more opportunities to engage with you. But just a reminder before we actually hand over to Bruce that we have a brief poll, or 2 brief polls actually. The first one is on Zoom, and it's a quantitative poll. You'll see the poll question up on your screen now. Please rate your satisfaction with today's session from a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being highly satisfied to 1 being very dissatisfied. If you can rank this particular consultation on the effectiveness, we'd be very grateful, and we'll feed that back to you before handing over to Mr. Bruce Dunn again. And then we also have the original mentee poll, which I informed you about earlier. The question is essentially the same, but you can answer using a few sentences, 3 or 4 or 5, up to 30 minutes or 60 minutes after this consultation closes. We want to know how the ADB can improve the effectiveness of these consultations. So you can click on the link that's on the right-hand side of your screen, or if you already have the Menti app downloaded onto your device, the code for the poll is 322-8950. So please give us that feedback, because the ADB understand and appreciate that there is always room for improvement, but we want to know specifically how we can improve the levels of engagement and the effectivity or the effectiveness of these consultations. That would help future consultations engage with stakeholders more effectively so that they can better inform the safeguard policy review and update process. So if we could have the results of this poll and see what respondents answered, we see that over 80%, almost 90%, have said that they are either highly satisfied or somewhat satisfied with this particular consultation. However, 11% said that they were somewhat dissatisfied. So those responses are equally as important as the favorable responses. If you could let us know what specifically you were dissatisfied about. This is an anonymous poll on Menti, and how we can improve the level of your satisfaction. What specific actions can be taken to increase the level of satisfaction in future consultations? That would be great. So with that, I will offer the floor to Mr. Bruce Dunn, Director of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, to provide a wrap-up. The wrap-up will entail a summary of the deliberations, as well as what we can look forward to between now and the end of these consultation series in about March or April 2022. Mr. Dunn, over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you very much, Azim, and thank you to everyone who has joined today, and really appreciated the range of perspectives that you shared. Certainly some really good and useful observations about the implementation of the existing policy, as well as recommendations for issues that we should be considering as part of the new policy. Let me just summarize a list of some of the key issues that we've taken note of. This, of course, is just a brief summary. We will be capturing everything, key points from today in terms of a written summary that we'll be sharing back out with participants. And also you'll be able to access a recording of this session that we'll be making available in due course. So I'll just provide a sort of brief summary now. I've organized this a little bit in terms of issues. It's not necessarily in the order that they were raised in the session. But firstly, was in terms of screening and categorization and understanding the overall risks associated with involuntary resettlement. We had a number of questions and comments on this. You heard from us that we are considering to revise the way that we currently categorize projects. We have a threshold at the moment for our category A, or projects with potentially significant adverse impacts and risks. That threshold is 200 people with major impacts. As you've heard from the discussions today, we do still certainly need to consider the scale and the magnitude of the impacts, the number of people that would be affected. But importantly, we think it's not just the number, but also the context under which this occurs. Context involves looking at the capacity and track record of the clients or the borrowers, but of course there would also be a range of other issues. For example, in contexts of fragility, or a significant number of vulnerable households and vulnerable individuals that could be affected. We also noted that we'd like to move to a bit more of an integrated categorization. Certainly we're considering involuntary resettlement impacts still is very clearly undertaken as an area of importance on itself, but looking at those relationships also with other issues such as environmental impacts. So that was a first key issue. Second, we had a number of speakers that spoke about the importance of applying the mitigation hierarchy, where avoidance and minimization is really the first priority, and that needs to be part of project design. I think also an emphasis came there in terms of it needs to be considered very early on in the process. It's not just about looking at the technical viability of the project, but how will it affect people and what are the options and alternatives. In responding to some of that, we did talk about alternatives analysis. I think we also need to look there at making sure that alternatives analysis is robust. Obviously, how many people are being affected by different options. Are they poor? Are they vulnerable? These contextual issues, what measures can be taken to avoid that, and really looking at the best option in terms of outcomes for people. In relation to that issue, we also had questions and points about documentation. Where can you find such information? And I think there we had a number of points around that information being provided within feasibility studies and options analysis, but also recognizing that there is sort of iterative processes here. So this came up actually when we talked about project preparation versus what happens during the implementation stage. And even when you get into the next stage of implementation, maybe detailed design, there are also still opportunities for avoidance and minimization during that process. So you can also find some of this information available within monitoring reports. But I do think a key message there is that we do need to strengthen the alternatives analysis, and it also needs to be very clear in the documentation. So that is certainly a key point there. Next, I'll mention the scope of the policy. We have mentioned that we'd like to expand from just focusing on involuntary resettlement to looking at a broader range of issues around, say, negotiated settlement or voluntary land donations. But we heard also from stakeholders that if it's voluntary forms, it needs to be truly voluntary, and that is something that we would certainly agree with. There should not be coercion or intimidation or threats of violence or any other form. You can't also have a voluntary process that then has a threat of involuntary resettlement hanging over your head if you don't come to the right terms of agreement. Related to that, though, of course, we had points related to the need for good due diligence, and that due diligence should also consider what's happened in the past. It's a process where decisions and influence could have been taken before ADB has been involved in the process, and that needs to be considered as well. Next, we spoke a bit about the roles and responsibilities of both ADB as well as our clients, developing member countries and the private sector. I think a recommendation at the early part of the consultation was that the role of ADB needs to be very clear. Clearly responsibilities are with the borrower and client to meet the safeguard policy requirements, but ADB's roles and responsibilities also need to be clearly defined in the new policy. Particularly, I think, on our due diligence roles, monitoring roles should be well defined. This also leads me to mention around preparation before and after ADB management and board consideration. We had one clear comment there that we need to be doing the due diligence and doing all of the assessments up front. We also heard from some of the ADB team around that being very important and needs to be strong, but also some practical considerations and a proposal also around some use of frameworks that would allow us to sort of scope the potential impacts and do a certain amount of preparation and consultation, but also provide a framework for further assessment and the procedures under which that would be taken. So that is one area for further consideration. I think there would be different views on that we'd still be welcome to hear. Monitoring, very important. I won't say more on this now, except I think it's well recognized to look at strengthening monitoring processes. There are clear responsibilities for the borrowers and clients, but also ADB's role, as well as roles of, say, independent monitoring and third parties for projects with potentially significant risks. Then there was comment about the use of escrow accounts. We heard from Irina around how we would like to give some definition on when that can be used in exceptional cases, because it's not defined in the existing policy. And then lastly, I mentioned around definitions and data. This was something we heard early on, including the review that's been undertaken by Ungewald, which has shown some discrepancies in the availability of data and maybe some differences in the way that data is presented. So that's also another issue that we need to look at. So this quick summary of some of the key issues, but certainly it was a very rich harvest of points for us to consider as we move forward. So look, thank you very much again to everyone for helping us and sharing these views. We'll be reflecting on this in the summary for the meeting, but also we'll be going back and updating the analytical report and disclosing that. And of course, this will feed into the further development of the policy. So a lot of things for us to consider, and we'll be looking very carefully at your recommendations. So thank you once again. So that concludes today's consultation, but we will be running other consultations on this same topic throughout the week. And some of you may be interested to join those. So please have a look at the schedule, and we'll be looking forward to engaging with you further throughout the process. So thank you again. Take care.
Thank you.